is my pleasure to welcome today to my show Mr. Kenneth Morris, the chairman of the Conservative Friends of Romania, a British conservative organization which focuses upon British Romanian elections. Hello, Mr. Morris. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hello there. Pleasure to be here.
I'll start by asking if you're familiar with the recent permanent suspension of Ion Cristoiu's TikTok account, and if so, what is your reaction to this move, especially given Ion Cristoiu's historic stature in Romanian journalism?
So I am aware, of course, and I think anyone that's really been interested in Romania, especially Romania's recent history, will have heard of Mr. Cristoiu and, of course, of this recent case. Really a scandal, we would say, really, in my opinion, I think in any conservative's opinion. I'm aware of the case from a British perspective. I would say it's no surprise. We have very similar stuff going on in the UK. So, with what's gone on, especially since Mr. Georgescu's sort of come on the scene, and there's been a real crackdown in Romania on anything that's considered, you could say, dissent, but perhaps just not mainstream, not establishment. And this is a particularly notable example, which is perhaps even more worrying because we know there have been cases with, individuals, private individuals on social media who've been shut down for supporting whichever position. But to have such a prominent journalistic figure shut down in this way, it really shows kind of how bad things have got. In my opinion, I would say. So, yeah, I'm not happy about it. I'm shocked as you would be, but not totally surprised. I have to say this is where things are going, I'm afraid.
Now, I believe it is very interesting that an account with 80 million likes was once shut down and then suspended a second time, and both times were right before the elections. The post that caused controversy expressed opinions about the abusive annulment of the elections by the Constitutional Court of Romania, as well as a post about former Prime Minister Marcel Ciolacu, who admitted that the annulment was part of the ruling powers plan. Now, this post reflected personal viewpoints. They were non-violent, without insults, and with no justification for the account's closure, except that they posed the ruling power in Romania. So this is where we've ended up in Romania. We are no longer allowed to speak out against those in power. I'm asking you, how can Romanians reclaim their wonderful right to free speech, as President Trump once called it?
Well, I think, as with any of these things, you have to draw a red line somewhere as a society. I think that when you have someone like Mr. Cristoiu who's getting persecuted, effectively what it is, online, being that social media is so important these days, it's not sort of just a casual thing, as you say, with such an amount of followers, with such a reach. And I mean, not to say that the British press is so fantastic, but especially in Romania, where there's a lot of politicized press, where it's actually controlled or funded or influenced by various sources, you need that online space to get the independent journalism out there. I mean, in order to guard free speech in such an instance, you have to take a stand and say, okay, as a society, we who support, whether you support Mr. Cristoiu's publications or you support free speech in general, you say, look, this is where we're going to make a point of this, and we're not going to be quiet, we're not going to shut up about it. So that's the first thing you have to do, I think, is to say no further than this, make a big noise about it, get, of course, international people interested in the case and involved in these sort of things. I think that's definitely the way to do it. Mr. Trump says about the right to free speech. Of course, it's a right that you have to fight for. And in Romania, of course, this has been sort of 35 years or so since free speech has really become a thing after the communist period. And so it's quite a young democracy. It's going to be fragile because you have figures who either were tied in with the previous establishment or in some way have made their mark as a result of less than good things being done and so on, and they have something to hide. And this is where you need journalists, you need investigative journalists and all this to clean up the mess and found a country that you can then go on to pass on to your children and so on and so forth. So it really is a battle as well. I don't think that it can just be a case, perhaps like where in America, where you can appeal to certain institutions that have existed for a couple of hundred years and there's certain precedents and whatever. Here, really, we're still seeing the foundations laid in Romania. people like Mr. Christoiu are part of that. And this is an attempt really to slide back, and it doesn't take so much to slide back to the 1980s. It's not so long ago. So in that way, really, you've got to make it an active battle, a live conversation in that way, and try all the things that are outside the establishment, like I say, social media and so on, to keep that fight going. And then eventually, if Romania can get a government that wants to enact these sort of changes, and the people have the ability to influence that, then we can see these things getting solidified. But as you can see from such actions, the whole establishment has problems from the top to the bottom, really. So it's a fight, really. The fight's on. You've got to really go for it.
Ion Cristoiu and others have accused in Romania Minister Cătălin Predoiu of orchestrating a wider campaign against critical voices. Are such allegations cause for concern within the international conservative community?
So with Minister Predoiu, especially from last year onwards, it's definitely a concern, because this is a senior minister. We're talking about, of course, an EU country, a NATO country, and so on. I mean, the biggest concern to me, as a British conservative, of course, we think about it from a kind of Brexit angle. We're already a bit suspicious about some elements of the European Union's activities anyway. But the fact that this can go on in a European Union country at the highest level and not be questioned by the higher ups in any sort of substantive way is an even greater concern. The fact that this can go on the EU's watch. And if you look, leaving the EU and going back to Britain, if you look at Britain, for example, even we've had similar activities over the past year or so, since the new Labour government got in, especially, where people have been arrested for comments on Facebook, Twitter, and so on. And usually it's people who are ordinary people expressing their views, not in a nuanced way, so they can be caught out here and there. And this is a similar sort of mechanism that's being utilised. But certainly, as we saw with the annulling of the elections, some European Union officials didn't seem too against the whole thing, and perhaps even from what we know in Britain, what we read is perhaps there's some involvement, even some support for this sort of action. So, I mean, with that being said, it's very, very concerning. If you just let it slide, it will just become the norm. And it has to be stopped. And I mean, Romania really is an example country. I mean, as it's sort of now becoming this eastern border of NATO, and NATO is meant to be sort of protecting democracies and independence of countries and so on. Really, you want Romania to be a showpiece of how you can do it right. And now it's really, you're developing the infrastructure to do it completely wrong. No, it's a very bad thing. And so hence why conservatives like myself are very interested in what goes on in Romania in cases like this. I think it's very relevant, yeah.
What lessons can the UK and Romania learn from each other in defending freedom of expression and resisting the authoritarian tendencies from the European Union? And I'd like the public not to forget that J.D. Vance and Donald Trump accused the European Union of restricting the freedom of expression.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to the European Union, we cannot forget that it's not a sinless institution in itself, as you say, quoting Vance and Trump there. We'd say the same from Britain. I mean, we really left for a reason, and leaving the European Union above all was a matter of sovereignty, a matter of suspicion of these bureaucratic structures that exist in Brussels and across the EU and so on. So absolutely, we have this suspicion there. How we would learn, as you say, from each other. Certainly, Britain has something to learn from Romania. I mean, Romania has very good independent journalists, like Mr. Cristoiu, very good investigative journalism that's been there, from the 90s going on. A very active population that do go online. They do watch these things. They talk about these things. There is still that spirit in the population. In Britain, it's much more. We've become much more aware in recent years, much more suspicion of the mainstream media. But I'd say we are much more trusting in our institutions. It's good. It's good to have institutions you can trust. But I think we've become a little bit too trusting over the years. And hence why many people would say, okay, things have happened in the country that I wouldn't agree with, but the government's done it anyway. But I don't really know how I can engage with institutions to change that at all. Once you're in government, you're in power. In Romania, of course, like in any country, once you're in government, you're in power. But there is this sense of critiquing the establishment very closely, even down to the individuals. People, the journalists know what this individual's like, what that individual's like. They really get it out there. I think the on the ground stuff, people in the UK can learn from Romania there. On the other side, I would say to learn from the UK, I mean, we spend so much time as conservatives criticizing what's going on in the UK, but what we do have a pretty good legal system. Let's put it that way. I mean, it's not perfect, but it is trustable. We had a recent Supreme Court verdict on sort of gender issues and whatever that was very commonsensical. So it shows even in a very sort of liberal country like the UK, you can have these things. I think the importance of the judiciary is so crucial. I mean, when one looks into the nature of the constitutional court, for example, in Romania, it becomes very strange, very, very confused how it all functions and how they can pull off such things, like when they annulled the elections and so on, and all the mechanisms behind it. You realize that what Romania has a lot of clever people who've created systems that can, in principle, be very useful. But it's actually having the right people in those positions and having the staff there, the judiciary especially, so important, and obviously in the police and so on. I think that, the UK side, we have managed to maintain a pretty good situation there, judiciary side. And I think it's just, we benefit, of course, from having a long-standing, many centuries long institutions, establishments, and so on. But in terms of our way of doing things, I think that there's a certain degree of fairness, there's a certain degree of expectation from public officials. I think perhaps something in Romania is that people are quite pessimistic now. They sort of expect public officials to just be corrupt, or just to not really do their job. I think certainly perhaps ramping up what you expect from politicians is worth doing. It's worth thinking that you can get the people you deserve in power. I think there are parties out there and there are people in Romanian politics now that are good. I mean, it's really about getting them into power. I mean, right now, of course, you've got the presidential elections coming up, things like that. These people do have power. They can enact change, It's about actually believing that you can change the system. Because you can, there are mechanisms for that. And, British people are always optimistic. And I'd say perhaps you could learn a little bit of optimism from us in that way, I would say. But yeah, I think that's what I would give on that, yeah.
This suspension affected not just a journalist, but a mentor and voice who shaped multiple generations. Do you believe there's a danger in allowing algorithms or opaque corporate rules to override cultural and democratic values?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, on the side of the mentor, the voice, and that kind of thing. I think that's a very important point because, of course, what we have in the UK, we call it the long march on the institutions. This takeover of the civil service, of the media, and so on, by the left, or sinister people in any way. And of course, then what they do is quite crucially they pull the ladder up. They cut off new people. If you don't fit their ideology, they won't train you in this profession or that profession. And slowly, the idea is you conquer professions like the media or the law or whatever. This is the idea. So when you take out people who are mentors, who are conduits for training up people, you're cutting it off. And inevitably, you kill that profession in the end if you carry on like that, persecuting these people who would be effectively the professors of the next generation. I think that's a very, very sinister thing indeed on the cultural side. When it comes to, you mentioned the corporate element of it, absolutely. I mean, I think in Romania, the argument of Minister Predoiu was that, social media is a public space, so the police can regulate it because it's like if you were, in the street or something like that. But the point is, if it is, a public space, it should be treated as such, as opposed to a space that is, privately owned or corporately managed or whatever. And of course, social media companies have to make their money and whatever it is, they provide a service. But I think because of the way things have gone, social media has become a sort of public space and it has to be treated very differently. Just like if any company developed a monopoly that was, extremely disproportionate to what you might have expected them to get, you need to regulate it for the protection of the private citizen, in that way. but key for the protection of the citizen as opposed to so that the state can enforce whatever. So certainly when it comes to TikTok, Facebook and whatnot, I think that's right. And I think that's why, of course, Elon Musk, for example, purchased Twitter, now X. Of course, that was his driving sort of idea behind that, free speech. Even Facebook got quite a bad rap. I think even Zuckerberg now is talking recently, in recent weeks, about we've got to change something. So this stuff's happening in America. They are starting to talk that way. Certainly in Britain, we're having the same conversations because we're having similar problems with social media. What can you say? What can't you say? And so on. Absolutely, there have to be some rules. I mean, on the absolute edge of things, you can't just have a criminal activity promoted or whatever. There's certain elements, but that's within the acceptable public discourse of morality. When you're talking about criticizing political systems or holding them to account, this is a function of society that's required. It has to be protected in its way. So it's totally different. And the mechanisms that you use to enforce rules on social media and whatever, that should be for these sort of things, prevention of violence and so on, not for adjusting what you're allowed to do in terms of criticizing the government. Of course, you make your critique, you're right or wrong, but the government can respond to that. It's a dialogue between the people and the state. The business getting in the way of that doesn't really make any sense.
Now, going back to Minister Predoiu, Ion Cristoiu warned that as long as Cătălin Predoiu remains in office, free and fair elections in Romania are not possible. If political leaders like Predoiu are indeed hostile toward free expression, what are the implications for Romania's future within the European Union?
Well, I think we have to put it this way. It's a very worrying thought. Certainly, if it becomes, Romania is now being called a hybrid regime now, is what they're saying. It sort of has some democratic institutions, but they don't really change anything because they can just cancel it whenever they like. And so with Minister Predoiu's actions, absolutely you can see where this fear comes from. And I think the way I look at it in terms of, is it possible to have free elections at all? I think it's on such a road where if it continues down this road, that will be the case. There's no doubt that the establishment will lock things. They can block candidates. They can shut down journalists. Ministers like Predoiu in power, this is what they want, effectively. The game is controlled in every aspect. I certainly think so. What I would say is I think this election coming up right now, I think that there is still a chance of some, even if there is corruption, even if there is interference, because of the overwhelming, support that outside candidates have had from the diaspora, for example, and so on, and the international attention that's been brought now, I think that this is kind of the last chance in that way for Romania. I think still if they can pull it off, they can do something. And even if they won the election, they tried to shut it down again, I think such a scandal would explode from that, internationally as well as nationally, that, I agree with the comments for the future, but I think there's still a little chance now. I think so. If we can kick them out now, I think so, yeah. But otherwise, yeah, it's bad news.
And finally, how does this issue affect the broader perception of Romania among British conservatives, especially at a time when global partnerships are being reassessed post-Brexit?
Well, I think it's very important because in the UK, Romania has never really been a major sort of geopolitical item on the agenda. Of course, we deal with the US, France, Germany, Russia, whatever, our former empire, Commonwealth, these sort of countries. However, the things that you did hear, the media was kind of against. People don't really know about Romania. It's very easy to get bad press and so on. As we left the EU, we're looking to make new relationships, and the importance of Romania in its region is very, very, very important in its geopolitical region in Southeast Europe. You've got the Black Sea, you've got Russia over the road, Turkey there. It's a crucial country. People are starting to wake up to that, and this is the opportunity now to make new partnerships. So this is the time we should really be learning more about countries like Romania. That's something I advocate for myself. However, if the first thing that you hear, and this is the kind of thing that gets news attention, is something like this, where journalists shut down, elections cancelled, and all this, it's terrible. It's terrible because the number one thing for investment is stability. And really, you need to encourage those economic ties, the trade ties, and so on, as well as the political diplomatic. I think it's very, very bad there, and I think it's very easy to underestimate how things are seen from the British angle. We really respect principle. Okay, if people say we're just going along with what we're told from Western Europe, it's not really enough. You've got to say, are you doing the right thing or the wrong thing? You know, you can't just say he told me to do it or whatever at the end of the day. It doesn't make for a solid partnership. So certainly post-Brexit, we're trying to be like the poster for that, for opportunity. Again, we've got a left-wing government at the moment, unfortunately. So that does change things. But from a conservative angle, certainly this is only damaging the reputation of Romania. However, it is making martyrs and heroes out of those who resist. So, you know, it has both sides to it. Now people are talking about these figures. They're actually actively talking in Britain and America. People are visiting our media, even the mainstream media is getting involved. So, you know, if there is an opportunity, a window where we can use this now, use this attention to use it to the good, for sure. But for Romania's reputation going forward, yeah, these need to be cleaned up, these things, you know. Once you've got this sorted, then you can sort the law, you sort all these things. Then even to convince the Romanians in the diaspora to start coming back, of course, so important to Romania's future as well. But yeah, from a British angle, a lot of us are watching closely now. And we're watching closely to see what happens in the next few days as well.
Mr. Kenneth, thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.